Welcome to the latest Straight Up Craft Dev Day, setting up craft with Vagrant. Today, Jason McCallister is going to give us a tour of the process and get us up to speed on things, and I'll let him take it from here. Jason, welcome.
Thanks, guys. Hey, I'm glad to be here, and I've been talking about doing this for a while. I know some of you haven't used Vagrant, and maybe some of you have. This isn't going to be really anything special on how to set up Vagrant specifically for a craft, but more of the workflow and how you're going to manage these things and some tools that you can use to use Vagrant. So a lot of people don't have a Vagrant environment installed, and I'm a big believer in that because if you look at your production and your development environment, I think they should match. So with that said, let's figure out how to share my screen. And I have a few slides to go through, and then we'll jump right into questions and go from there. Can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Perfect. So why Vagrant? A lot of people ask that question, and they don't really understand the concept behind it. So Vagrant it's not necessarily a virtual machine. It is a tool to manage your virtual machines, whether it's you're using VMware or you're using VirtualBox, and they have some other stuff which I haven't used, but it also supports. You can choose a type of Linux distribution you want to build off of, which is really critical. So there's lots of reasons to choose Vagrant, and one just because I think it's the best way to go. You don't have to worry about setting up MAMP, which leads its own issues, but it's gotten a lot better with 3.0 of MAMP or WAMP or whatever you're using. But you also have a matching development environment, and if you're working with remote teams, having the same Vagrant file in your Git repo is very useful because they can bring up the exact same thing that you're working on, so there's no differences and less downtime and them trying to set up their server to get started to work on that project too. Troubleshooting specific PHP versions, which is important. As we know, if you do PHP work, 5.3, 4, and 5 all have different quirks, if you will, and some people like to use different array syntaxes, and that causes a lot of issues. So, or if you're having a server, if you're running on DigitalOcean, you have an Ubuntu machine, and you're having the specific problem, you can configure your Vagrant machine, your virtual machine, to basically look just like your DigitalOcean machine. So, and the last reason is keep your host machine clean the way it should be. Everything should be clean, and let's be honest, if you're on your machine, you might be doing work, but most of the times you just want to listen to music or whatnot. So, oh, by the way, if you have any questions, just feel free to yell at me and just ask them. I'll make sure there's plenty of time at the end to ask any questions. So if you have them, write them down, and at the end we'll have a big discussion and talk more in depth about workflows and different tools. So as you can see here, I have a MacBook Pro, and I am working on a craft website, let's say in my Vagrant 512 machine, that's going to be put on the development server or the staging server. So I have that there. I can test my craft site, make sure that 5.3 works, which of course 5.3 works because that's the requirement for craft. But more specifically, you could have a plugin you're working on that requires 5.4, and you're just so used to 5.4, you put it in production and it's broken, and that's just bad. So the goal here is you can have completely separate machines inside of your machine, and then they're isolated. You have whatever you want configured in them, just the way you want it, or just the way your team has it set up. So there's no discrepancies between your development environment and theirs, which is the real key for Vagrant. So let's look at the workflow a little bit. So a lot of people get a little confused when you put a Vagrant machine in. Are you supposed to work inside the Vagrant machine? Are you supposed to work on your Mac or your Windows machine? Most of the work is done here on your MacBook Pro. where you have Atom, Sublime, PHP Storm, Photoshop, you have Git, you have all those tools that you would typically use in your workflow are on your MacBook, so most of your work is done here. The thing that's nice about Vagrant is it defaults to sync that folder that you're working in. So if you have craft in that folder, it'll sync to the Vagrant machine, which has your web server, your database server. That means that you can, if you have an 8 gig machine and you want to use a 4 gig, I wouldn't recommend using half, but if you want to use a 4 gig Vagrant machine, then you're a little bit more robust with what you can accomplish, instead of having Photoshop running and adding Apache and different versions and a database on top of your MacBook. You're running it all separated and can shut it down at any time. So Vagrant files and basic commands. So we're just going to go over a few of these. There's a lot of things that have happened in 1.5 and 1.6 of Vagrant, so if you're not up to date, you should get up to date. I'm not going to cover those, but here's some of the basic stuff. So if you're in Terminal, you go to your directory you're going to work in, so you're going to set up a new project, and the first thing you do is Vagrant init, which will create a, I say bare, but it's not really bare, Vagrant file that has a list of all the settings, a default box, and then you are free to configure it with whatever you want, set up your scripts or anything you need to do. It's literally blank, there's no PHP, there's no nothing. So that creates a file in that directory. Now when you're still in that directory, Vagrant up will bring up, it'll create a new machine if there's not one that exists. It'll create a new virtual machine, bring it up, and configure it with whatever's in the Vagrant file or whatever scripts the Vagrant file links to. So if it's blank, it's just going to build it up, it's going to download that box locally and put it in your cache on your machine, so the next time you do a Vagrant up, you won't have to download, say, Ubuntu 14.04. You don't have to go through that process of waiting for it to download. It's cached locally on your machine, which improves speed. Vagrant suspend, it's very simple. Suspends it instead of shutting it down, just so next time you Vagrant up, you're up in a couple seconds instead of 30 or 40. Vagrant halt does the exact opposite, completely shuts down the VM. Vagrant status shows you the status of that machine that's in that directory. And then Vagrant destroy says bye-bye to your machine and will completely wipe it, but it doesn't delete the Vagrant file. So if you broke something while you were installing it, you exit out of your SSH, and then you hit Vagrant destroy, and your machine's gone, and you can boot off that Vagrant file again just like that. So the important thing is that these commands work from the Vagrant directory only. Now there's ways you can get around that, but we're not going to discuss that here. So now here's what a basic Vagrant file would look like after you hit Vagrant in it. It has a lot more stuff for it, but for brevity I took a lot of it out. So you have your Vagrant API version, and then it gives you a box, that config VM box base. That's the default one. I don't have that downloaded, so I'd have to cache that locally and go from there. You configure a private or a public network. I typically stick with private because it's only available to my machine. And then you can configure the RAM to, let's say, 1024 or 2048, whatever you want to use, or 512 if you don't have much RAM on your host machine. And that's basically the essential Vagrant file on Vagrant init, and that's what you get. But a lot of people say, I don't have time to set up a whole Linux server and start it over and over again and configure this for every single project. So a lot of people think you have to be a system administrator for this, but that's not true to some aspect. If you wanted to build your own custom box, not a machine, a box that other people can use, you do have to get your hands dirty, and you will have to learn to install PHP and configure firewalls and all that stuff. And that's an option, but not a lot of people do that because there's a lot of tools out there. And because of that, we have a lot of options for those who just want it to work. And we're going to go over some of those. So option one is Puphpet, or however you pronounce it. I have no idea. So Puppet is nice because it gives you this GUI that configures everything, and I mean literally everything. If you want to connect your Vagrant machine to DigitalOcean or Amazon, that's all set in there. If you want to choose your provider, you can choose your distribution. You can choose between Apache, PHP or Hack, MySQL, MariaDB, Postgres, and a lot of options. And it's all done by a GUI, and it creates a file for you. You download that file, and you change to that file, and you Vagrant up, and it'll configure everything for you and import that box. So in this example, you have Debbie and Wheezy 7.5 ready to go. So adding sites to this, a lot of people use, if they're working on one project, they work on that project will have its own Vagrant box. But I kind of have a massive one that has all of them. So this is a little more complex, not that difficult, but a little more complex to set up new sites after you've configured it and downloaded the files. It's not impossible, but it just makes a few extra steps. So the next option is Vaprobash. And Vaprobash is for the do-it-yourself type of person, and it has an enormous amount of options and installation settings that you can just use uncomment a line out. So the documentation is great if you visit their website, Fidelopers on GitHub. He's got everything for every option he has and how to do it and how to add sites and how to add Nginx blocks or Apache virtual hosts and etc. When you download the Vaprobash Vagrant file, it literally is just a Vagrant file that you uncomment lines on what you want to install. You configure your IP, your server, swap your MySQL root passwords, host names, everything. So once you get that configured and uncommented on what you want to install, all you gotta do is run Vagrant up, and it'll run scripts off his GitHub account, and you're good to go with whatever you specified. Again, there's a lot of options. You have every kind of database you could possibly work with in PHP development. Not all of them, but a good majority of the ones you're probably going to work with. You can choose between Apache and Nginx. It also has Composer. You can install Memcache, Redis, Node.js, and a lot more. And like I said, his site is very well documented, so I would just go through there. And if you have any questions. The last option is my favorite one, is Homestead. Homestead is I'm sorry, was there a question? No? Okay. Homestead is a pre-configured box, meaning unlike Vaprobash, you don't have to install scripts and wait for it to boot up. So once you install it, it's good to go. The box is there locally, and it's got, it's Ubuntu 14.04, PHP 5.5, Nginx, everything you see on the screen, it's pre-installed with. And it is tuned specifically for PHP. And if you use Forge, it is like your local environment for working with Forge. That being said, it is something provided by the Laravel framework, and a lot of people have the misconception that because it's tuned for Laravel means it won't work. That's not true. My machine is a 4 gig Homestead machine, and I run all my craft websites on that. The key to Homestead is it's very simple and very easy to read documentation. All of your configuration is done in your homestead.yaml in that directory, which that's it. When you install it, that's all you have. Your IP, your memory, your CPUs. It's set up for SSH authentication, so all you have to do is put the path to your public key. You sync folders, and you can add more folders to it as you please, and just Vagrant halt and Vagrant up to build it. But you have to add the Nginx stuff. I'll just go over their documentation. I don't want to get into that too much, but he has easy scripts and tools that are built in the virtual machine that allow you just to create a new server with one command, and that's it. And that's documented as well here. So again, it's really simple, easy to read. It's tuned for PHP, Forge, and works well with Craft. And I'm not trying to sell Forge, but if you want to learn more about Forge, Laracast has some good stuff on there. which has automatic Git deployments and a bunch of extra tools that are really, really useful to developing or moving to production. And that's it. I said I was going to be quick, so I would like to make this more of a conversation. So if you have any questions, please feel free to answer or ask. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Jason.
No worries. Nobody has a question?
I have one.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that it works well with DigitalOcean workflow. Is there, and this may sound really stupid, but is there a way I can take an image like from a backup of my DigitalOcean server and import it into Vagrant directly?
Of your DigitalOcean server?
Yeah.
The box that comes with DigitalOcean, let me switch the screen. Okay.
So is this kind of a general question, John? Like if you want to match any server you're working on, like can you do that?
If I'm running my craft site on DigitalOcean and I want to basically make a mirror of that locally, because right now I'm using MAMP, is that something that I can do? Just take my DigitalOcean machine as it exists and import it into Vagrant?
I don't think there's a way. DigitalOcean might have a box that they use, because the way that DigitalOcean does it is they take like say Ubuntu, and they take their specific box and they have it tuned exactly the way they want, and that's what they build off. So they're not actually getting a base Ubuntu. They've pre-configured it, and I think vagrantcloud.com has a list of anyone who publicly shares those boxes. So Homestead's on there. Ubuntu has their base boxes tuned specifically for Vagrant there as well. So I would search there. I haven't looked specifically, but I'm sure they probably have one. It would make sense.
Cool. Thanks.
No worries.
And Jason, Ian has a question in the chat here. Do you set up a Vagrant box for every craft install, or do you have one box that runs multiple sites?
I have one 4 gig machine. It depends on the project. If I'm working with a different type of host, then I'll set up a machine that's pretty close to that as I can get. But for the most part, I have one machine that's just general craft development, and I just stick with that. I don't want to. I'm a space person, so I don't like to have a lot of space used on my machine.
How do you work in a team environment where you've got several developers working on a single instance?
On a single instance?
Yeah, on a single craft instance.
So that kind of goes into the workflow part of it, where you have your host machine that has your Git files, and you just have to write a really good Git ignore, and say you have a repository that has all your Git stuff, your craft stuff, your plugins, your documents, stuff like that. Well, in the root of that, I typically have a Vagrant machine, or a Vagrant file, and then I just spin that up as I need it. And using Git, you can just push and pull as needed, and whenever there's a change on either the Vagrant machine or the host machine, they'll sync automatically, typically using what's called NFS. So it's pretty quick, and there's no lag. I haven't really seen any. So
yeah, no, I've made specifically for the MySQL piece for the actual database. So
that's the part that sucks.
Yeah.
So,
I was wanting to see if anybody else had solved that problem.
I have some theories on that, on how that's going to be solved, and that's not going to come from us. I think Pixel and Tonic's has their head around something, and I'd like to see where they're going to go. But usually it's just dump and import, which sucks, but that's the only real feasible way.
So the first Vagrant project I worked on was actually a Drupal project, and our Vagrant file basically grabbed a SQL dump of the live site because the live site was still on the go, so there was a constant pullback of whatever was on production into development, which was fine. But yeah, I've not seen anything that will yet kind of go the other way and move those changes from dev into production. So.
Well, I know Wes Rice today in Google Plus, he posted something about this open, I think it's open source tool that lets you sync the databases. I'm not exactly sure what it was called again, but like dbv.php or something like that. I'll see if I can post that after this. But I haven't used it, but I've seen it. So.
Yeah.
I have a question. Does Vagrant? I haven't used it ever before. I understand the concept and the rough benefits. Does it affect what tools you can use in your workflow? If you spin up your Vagrant machine, can you still use your favorite text editor, FTP program, or any other like designer-friendly tools that you might want to use versus like needing to SSH in on the command line and do everything?
So that is a good question, and shame on you for saying FTP.
Well,
but they have the way it runs with that sync file is everything you do is on your host machine. You don't have to worry about. You just have to worry about bringing it up, making sure it's up, and that you can get to it on your machine. Other than that, everything is done in Atom, Sublime. You don't ever have to really see the Vagrant machine at all. You just work like you normally would. And the files you're working on just get synced to the Vagrant machine. So when you open your browser and go to, let's say, craftdemo.dev, that points to your local machine, then you're done. That's it. So you can still use Tower and Git and all that stuff. So there's no difference in the workflow, just how you get to it. Instead of using MAMP, you use Vagrant.
Okay. So you just use your normal, since you're spinning up a virtual machine, do you have to access the browser within the virtual machine? No, you could use your normal web browser on your computer.
Yep.
Okay. It's just available on whatever port it's on, and you control the network settings of where that is somewhere.
Yeah, the key thing I should have probably put in there is on a Mac, you have your etc/host file. And what's important about that file is whatever you set it to, if you set an IP and a domain name, that overrides DNS altogether. So if I set it to 127.0.0.1 and then google.com, then google.com is going to go to my homepage, and then that's it. Or my machine, I'm sorry.
Okay. I think that there's a couple of other noteworthy things, especially when working with Craft, is that for example, I work for with a bigger team, and for the plugins that we're developing, oftentimes we're going to symlink a lot of this stuff. So if you have a Craft installation within a Vagrant box, and those files are being synced, which is basically the workflow Jason has described and one that I use too, I will have my plugins, for example, in one directory that it's also synced to my Vagrant box, and another one that's just for sites. Now, without Vagrant, I can easily just symlink a plugin, either the plugin directory to an install to try them all, or one at a time. But in Vagrant, people run into issues where they try to create the symlink in the host file, but it actually has to be created in the guest in order for that to work. So that's something that I don't know if anybody's doing symlink development with plugins in Craft, but if that's the case and your symlinks aren't working, you would have to symlink from within your Vagrant box. And obviously, if you have an Ubuntu box, you just use the LN tool or whatever. But that's something that's worth noting. And then there is one other thing. Depending on what tool you're using, for example, I use PHP Storm, and I use other GUI tools to access the database and actually view what I'm changing on the Vagrant box. And there is a couple of tricky ways to connect from the database, because you're not really connecting locally. So if I am on a Mac and I have something like SQL Pro installed, if you don't have Vagrant, you can easily just basically use localhost or the local IP address to log into MySQL. But in this case, if you are on a Vagrant box, you kind of have to SSH into it and set it up that way. With PHP Storm, PHP Storm has specific ways of doing that. SQL Pro has specific way of doing that, but they mostly revolve around SSH tunneling, which I think a lot of us use to connect from our local machine to a production server or something like that. But those are just a couple of things that I've noticed that are part of the workflow that can kind of throw people off when they're starting to get, when they start working with Vagrant. Is the other one is testing. If I'm testing my plugins, I'm doing the development locally on my host machine. So I'm developing my plugins or whatever. If I want to run the tests from my machine, then my machine has to be equipped with the tools necessary. Like if I want Xdebug, if I want something like coverage reports and all that kind of stuff, and then also the version of PHP, because they should at least match, the host and the guest. So there are a few things that are trickier when it comes to advanced development, but for the most part, I think that what Jason described as you never having to touch your Vagrant box is pretty accurate. And the things like when you do need to access its resources, like the database or something like that, you can still use a tool installed on your host machine. But if you do hit some roadblocks, oftentimes it will be because of the port forwarding, or because of the file syncing, if you're dealing with SIM linking and that type of stuff. So I just wanted to point that out.
That's a good point.
Is there anything else craft specific about a Vagrant setup, or it's really just running a website development environment for the most part?
Not really craft specific, but basically, if you're going to use a framework or craft or any kind of development, you still have to set up the database and stuff like that. And it's important to know that it's not like Selvin said, it's not your local machine, it's your guest machine that you're going to actually be configuring and connecting to. So that's the only real catch, per se. And different machines, or like the tools that I just showed, have different ways of how you connect to that, and it's pretty easy. It's pretty straightforward. It is mostly SSH tunneling and things of that nature. So
cool. Is there an easy way to keep everything about a Vagrant setup up to date? Like, I think you're using a separate, is it VirtualBox, or you need the VM software. I'm really skilled in the language around these things, but I know, like, when you read the instructions, there's multiple things you have to download. Do you have to update those? If you update all those, can you break your install, or is it pretty independent of those?
When you set up your Vagrant machine, you get that setup where it's literally just this file, this VirtualBox image that runs inside of that, and you do have to install Vagrant, you do have to install VirtualBox at a minimum, but you can also use VMware and stuff like that. That you have to pay for, though. That's why I don't use VMware. I should, but I don't.
Right on. Well, does anybody else have questions or comments, or want to share a workflow that they use?
Jason, have you used Vagrant Share at all?
I have a box that hasn't been connected when I was in my CentOS phase, and then Forge came out, and then I just was like, all right, I'm just going to use Ubuntu. PHP support on Ubuntu is far better than trying to get the EPEL set up on CentOS. So I plan to when I have time, but of course, no one ever has time to do what they want to do.
So one of the things that I really liked about Vagrant, and this has only really been in the last 3 months or so, is the ability to share a Vagrant box with someone. So you set up your Vagrant Cloud account which I think for small sites is free at the moment. I think it suits most people, the free version. But then from there I can log into Vagrant Share, create a share, and then send. It gives me a unique URL to my specific Vagrant instance on my machine, and I can send that URL to anybody, anywhere, and they can see what's going on within my Vagrant box.
Yeah, Vagrant's making lots of strides to making it easier to develop and work as a remote team.
Yeah. And it's great for client stuff as well, because I can send a client, or I can be on a phone call with a client in real time, with them on the website, the development website, me making a change and saying, hey, does this work for you? And if not, then we can revert it back. It's not a big deal, but it's certainly one of the cool things that I've seen this year.
So do you share those links with the client directly then, Stephen? And
they're one-off.
Okay.
They're one-off links, so it's only really at the time when you've got maybe a call with a client, you spin that up, and it works for, I think, maybe half an hour or something like that before it expires.
So you're sharing your local machine with them. Okay, see.
Yep.
That's neat. All right. Well, Jason, thanks so much for the presentation. Thanks everyone else for joining us on another Straight Up Craft Dev Day. Feel free to send us, ideas for new ones, or if you want to contribute and help lead one on a topic you love, just let me know. It's nice to have people jump in and share what they know.